So far in the unit, when I've asked you to look at the Declaration of Independence, I've given you this version, which is a transcription of something we call the Matlack engrossment. And engrossment is essentially just a writing out in beautiful script of a document. And this is a typed transcript of the Matlack engrossment that you will find if you ever visit the National Archives in Washington, D.C. This is the rotunda of the National Archives. And over there, I forget which one it is, one of those panels has behind it the original, beautifully scripted version of the Declaration of Independence. And it's called the Matlack engrossment because it was written out by this fella called Timothy Matlack. And so this is the version that we tend to look at as the definitive version of the Declaration of Independence. But there were several different versions, differing in various degrees. Some of them will be relatively small degrees, and if we're looking at drafts, we've actually got some quite significant differences. And when you put together your comparison matrix work on the Declaration, I'm going to want you to be comparing these different versions. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time going over some of these versions. So this is the Matlack engrossment, or a typed version of the Matlack engrossment. And the first publishing, though, of the Declaration was this one known as the Dunlap broadside. It's called a broadside, but a broadside was the name for basically a big poster-sized sheet. And the way that the Declaration of Independence was introduced to the world was on this Dunlap broadside, printed, not handwritten, printed out on big posters and put up on bulletin boards around town to say, this is our declaration. And there are some significant differences between this version and the Matlack version. If you look at the Matlack version, for example, if you look at the beginning, the opening paragraph there, when in the course of human events, we see course is capitalized, and also laws of nature and nature's God. Those are all words that are capitalized. In the 18th century, they were much more fluid with what they chose to capitalize. There weren't really rules as we have today, and they would capitalize for emphasis, among other reasons. And so you can see there's just a smattering of capitalized words. But if you compare that with the Dunlap version, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, to assume the powers of the earth, the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them a decent respect to the opinions of mankind, requires that they should declare the cause which impel them to the separation. Many, many more words here capitalized. It's like they're capitalizing every 5 seconds. Now, why is that the case? It could be something as simple as this. We know that on the day this was printed, Thomas Jefferson wasn't at the printers with them. How do we know this? Well, we know that he was off shopping. How do we know that? Because he's got a little entry in his diary about buying a pair of gloves on the very day that this got printed. Who was there at the printers? Quite possibly John Adams. We know that John Adams and Benjamin Franklin were helpers of Thomas Jefferson in drafting the Declaration, gave him a lot of feedback, helped him kind of revise his drafts. And perhaps it was Adams who was at the printers telling the printer to capitalize all these things, because unlike Thomas Jefferson, who was sort of more stately, sort of thought of himself as a stately gentleman, Adams was a, brash New Englander type, Boston boy, lawyer, probably spoke like this, and every time he wanted to stress a word, he put a capital letter in. And so you kind of get from the capital letters an Adams-like voice more than the more stately Jeffersonian voice. Now, that may seem sort of not necessarily that significant, or maybe it is. It gives you a certain different sort of feel for it. You all might have opinions about whether lots of capital letters are a great idea or whether you should be a bit more restrained in your capital letters. Think about ethos. Which author do you trust more or less? The one with all the capitals? Or the one with fewer capitals. You may notice that the current president, when he tweets, is often capitalizing everything, and that creates a different effect than someone who doesn't capitalize everything. In addition, we have something called the Goddard printing. I love the Goddard printing because it was printed by let's go to a version that we can see properly, printed by Mary Catherine Goddard. I think it's worth noting that. Let's go down here. There she is, Mary Catherine Goddard. And Mary Catherine Goddard, she puts her name there. She's the printer of this. This was a later printing of the Declaration. And this is a real act of courage. You know, we think about the founding fathers. We're always talking about the men being involved in the founding of the country. And of course, it was only propertied men who really had power, even as they were talking about equality. Here's someone, she's put her name at the bottom of this printing. This is a declaration that can get you killed. You know, you're declaring that you have as many rights as the King of England. And if he wins the War of Independence, you could be in trouble. And there's Mary Catherine. She winds up, when the Constitution is written 11 years later, she doesn't even get a vote. But she put her life on the line to print this. And I think that's kind of special. Furthermore, if you look at this one, you'll see that there are passages where there's not just the first letter, but the whole word is capitalized. And she particularly does it with things like divine providence. And so you might want to take a look at this version as well and decide, you know, which words is she choosing to capitalize. And I'm going to, in your comparison matrices, I want you to be thinking about the types of words that get capitalized in one version or the other version or another version. One more thing I'm going to ask you to do is to look at the original draft by Thomas Jefferson. Let's just give the opening draft a read. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for a people to advance from that subordination in which they have hitherto remained, let's compare that to the version we're familiar with. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth a separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. Again, let's go back to the original. And to assume among the powers of earth the equal and independent station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind, and so forth. Here, if we go back to the one we're familiar with, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. But Jefferson originally wrote, we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable, that all men are created equal and independent, that from that equal creation they derive rights inherent and inalienable, among which are the preservation of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. So you can see that there are some distinct differences. Jefferson originally wrote that the rights were sacred and undeniable, but Franklin or Adams suggested the perhaps more straightforward, self-evident. Jefferson originally talked about we get these rights from equal creation, but he was persuaded to change that to they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. And there are some other significant differences, one of which I want you to look at towards the end of all the long list of complaints against the king. Jefferson wrote, "He, the king, has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this execrable commerce, and that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished die. He is now exciting those very people to rise in arms among us and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them, and murdering the people upon whom he also obtruded them, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another." That is a very lengthy passage. Compare it to this reason, for depriving us of the benefits of trial by jury. This entire passage, all about the crimes of slavery, you won't find it in the final Declaration of Independence draft. And so when you are looking at these different drafts from this original declaration and the differences in the wording and the differences in what was left out, what was left in, I want you to be considering those differences, and also I want you to be considering differences such as capitalization, which words get stressed more than others. And then we can think a little bit about the implications of those differences, the implications of those choices. But to remind you again about equality, we think of the Declaration as being a document written by Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson wrote the initial draft. He worked with John Adams and Benjamin Franklin to revise that draft. It went to a printer who made adjustments to what he wanted to emphasize in capitalization. It was written out by someone who changed the capitalization. In fact, where although the Matlack version has much less capitalization, there is a part towards the end where he talks about in every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned, and he emphasizes that we there. And then you've got the Goddard version, which emphasizes a whole bunch of other words. And so consider those versions. All of those different printers and the people who drafted the document, Jefferson and Adams and Franklin, and then the various members of the other founders who made the choice of, let's get rid of the bit on slavery. Let's leave that out altogether. All of these people worked together to create the document that we now know of as the Declaration of Independence.